Hi, welcome to Digging for Truth, presented by Associates for Biblical Research. I'm Henry Smith. Today, one of our favorite guests is returning onto the program to talk about the Grand Canyon out in the western part of the United States. It's Dr. Andrew Snelling, who's a geologist with Answers in Genesis, and he returns again to share with us evidence related to the flood described in the book of Genesis. Andrew, welcome back to Digging for Truth, my friend.
Thanks, Henry. It's great to be back with you.
I'm so glad that you're here. For seasoned veterans who've watched the show, they've seen you here before, and I know lots of people have enjoyed watching the programs. Maybe if we could jump in quickly by if you could just tell us a little bit about your role at AIG for those who have not seen you before.
Yes, I am a research geologist, but also the Director of Research for Answers in Genesis, which is the core apologetics ministry that also runs the Creation Museum and the Ark Encounter, the life-size replica of Noah's Ark. And so my role is also looking after editor-in-chief of the Answers Research Journal, our online technical journal that's open access publication that's freely available. I write for the Answers magazine, our lay magazine. Obviously, I do research, lots of writing. I have a staff that I oversee, research astronomer, geneticist, and a paleontologist. And so it keeps me busy. I've been involved with Answers in Genesis now for nearly 40 years.
Excellent, excellent. Well, we're very appreciative of you sharing your expertise. And one of the subjects that you and I have talked about before, because of its significance, is the Grand Canyon, which I mentioned in my introduction, of course. Give us just a quick tutorial on the Grand Canyon, and then we'll dive into, over these next two episodes, the items that we want to discuss.
Yeah, well, the Grand Canyon is one of the natural wonders of the world. It can even be seen from the moon, because of the scale of the gash in the ground. It's 277 miles long, 18 miles wide at its greatest width, and over a mile deep. And it is a spectacular sight. Those who see it for the first time we like to blindfold a person and lead them to the edge and then take the blindfold off. And there's an audible gasp because you're not prepared for the magnitude, the scale of the vista. It's just incredible. But for geologists, it's a great place to go because unlike, there's bigger canyons, wider canyons, deeper canyons, but this one is unique because the layers that are exposed to view, you can go from the bottom of the Grand Canyon, where you're looking at the crystalline basement rocks that are foundational to every continent, and then stacked on top of them are these pancake layers of sedimentary layers, that's sediments that have been deposited by water, all the way up to the rim. And so you've got the whole span and scope of Earth history exposed to view. And so that's why this has been regarded as, in the textbook, as Exhibit A for millions of years of evolution. And why, as flood geologists and creation geologists, we battle there to demonstrate that the evidence, in fact, favours what we read in God's Word about creation, fall, curse, the flood, and of course that leads on to the gospel presentation, the biblical view of Earth history.
Yes, and that's the view that we hold at ABR, and we've talked about that many times on our program. Okay, so one of the things that we're going to focus on, the primary subject actually is your research that you've done in the Grand Canyon. Now, you just can't walk into the Grand Canyon as a geologist, start grabbing rocks and taking them away. There's a whole process you have to go through. So let's talk about that a little bit. The material that you targeted in your research, and then sort of how things unfolded after that.
Yes, well, it's only proper that there are rules, because if everybody just went in there with hammers and started belting away at rocks, it'd leave scars and ruin archaeological sites. So there's a proper process in place where you apply with a research proposal and you lay out what you want to do, and you know, fully argued and referenced, etc. And that's a proper process. Now, in the Grand Canyon, as I said before, you've got these horizontal stacked pancake layers of sedimentary rock layers. But most people don't realise that when you look into the Grand Canyon, you're actually on top of a plateau. At the south rim, it's 7,000 feet above sea level. And over at the north rim, it's actually 1,000 feet higher, 8,000 feet. If you go to the east, to the easternmost overlook, you actually find that there's an edge to that plateau. At the edge of that plateau, through which the canyon has been carved, the rock layers have been bent and dropped 3,000 feet out to the east. And so you can go to places in the canyon where these sedimentary rock layers, you can actually see the nice bends in the rock. The geologists call them folds, but you know, they're bent rock layers. Some of these are spectacular, bent through 90 degrees. And what is evident to everybody is that these bends are nice and smooth. What's the significance of that? Well, you know, let's take man-made rock called concrete. Everybody knows that if you try to break concrete, it's going to snap. You try to bend it, it's going to snap. When are you able to make concrete pipes, for example? When it's a slurry, it's wet, and then the cement hasn't dried and hardened to bind together the sand and the gravel. And that's exactly what happens with sedimentary rocks. The water carries the particles down, they're dropped down, and it's like a stack of golf balls. There's spaces in between, there's water in between the grains, and that dries out, and the chemicals that are in the water cement the grains together. That's exactly what happens in man-made concrete. When it's soft and wet, it's pliable, you can bend it, but when it's hardened and the cement has hardened to bind the grains together, it is really, really hard. And so for years, we've noticed these bends in the rocks, and it poses a significant research issue. The reason is because the conventional view is that the sedimentary rock layers making up the walls of the Grand Canyon, let's take the first of those layers, it's a sandstone called the Tepete sandstone. Remember, sandstone is sand that's turned to stone. It's really that simple.
Right.
And it's supposed to have been deposited 508, 509 million years ago, give or take, they say. And then all the other layers stacked up, some 10,000 feet of other layers were stacked up on top, all the way beyond the Grand Canyon, in fact, all the way up to Bryce Canyon. You can go through these 10,000 feet of layers. And then 450 million years after the first sandstone was deposited, the Tepete sandstone, the plateau was pushed up and the layers were bent. So, you know, hundreds of millions of years later, 450 million years between the laying of the sandstone and the bending. And in that time, with 10,000 feet of other layers above, you would expect the pressure and the heat of burial, etc., would have hardened the rock, it would have dried out, and so it should have fractured, it should have shattered.
Right.
Or
if you give it enough force to bend it. Yeah.
That's right. Or there had to be elevated temperature and pressure that made the rock more pliable.
Okay.
And so for years we've been looking at this, and I looked in the literature to see what had been done. And there were lots of claims about these bent rocks. Oh, well, they said, it had to be done under heat and pressure. Things, the grains rolled past one another and layers moved, etc., and it was all smooth and gradual over millions of years. And but nobody had actually taken samples or looked under the microscope to verify these claims.
All right, Dr. Snelling, on that point, we're going to have to go to a break. So let's do that, and then I want you to pick it up right from there. Friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back.
In a culture of intense Bible-denying skepticism, Associates for Biblical Research exists to strengthen followers of Jesus by affirming the authority of the Bible. Our archaeological fieldwork and original research form a strong foundation in upholding the reliability of the Scriptures. For students or anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible, please visit our website and partner with us by joining our prayer team or financially supporting this ministry. And thank you for standing with us.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with geologist Andrew Snelling. We're talking about the Grand Canyon. Now, Andrew, you're talking about the bending of rocks when we ended our last segment. And of course, intuitively, people are saying, yeah, that makes sense. You know, you have hard rock, you put pressure on it, and it should snap, one way or the other. So your idea was to test the hypothesis. In fact, what conditions would have caused this rock to be bent, and is the evolutionary model plausible?
Mm-hmm. That's right, Henry, because from a biblical perspective, that sandstone layer that I mentioned before would have been deposited early in the flood, and then the plateau was uplifted at the end of the flood, so the rocks would have still been wet and easily bent, and then dried out after the flood. So it should be sedimentation, bending, and then cementation, whereas the conventional view is sedimentation, sedimentation, then the cement hardening, 450 million years later, bending. So the only way to test this was to go and get samples and look at the rocks under the microscope. And I looked in the literature, and there was only one photograph of that sandstone under the microscope from 1945. No one had done the work. And so I applied to the Park Service in November 2013 for a research and sampling permit. I put in a research proposal, and I put in peer reviews, etc. And it was a few months later that I got a rejection letter without any clear indication that was any technical fault or scientific fault with my proposal. And so that was perplexing. However, we also knew from previous experience that there'd been evidence of worldview discrimination in the Park Service, and especially from external geologists putting pressure on the Park Service not to allow creationists in the park. And so the Alliance Defending Freedom got involved because they had been involved in a previous case, and they put in a Freedom of Information request to get the correspondence between the Park Service officials at the Grand Canyon National Park and external people. And sure enough, it netted the reviews, which were from 3 conventional secular geologists. And in all 3 reviews, they focused on me as a creationist and scorned my views and said creationists shouldn't be allowed to do research in the park. Only one of them made some trivial technical comments. So I went through the process of making revisions, refining the application, and resubmitted it in early 2016. And then they rejected that again, and they said, well, we want you to do a trip through the canyon and photograph every site that you want to sample. And then when you've submitted that with all that information, we'll decide if you can go ahead. Well, again, we, talking to the lawyers at the Alliance Defending Freedom, they said, look, this is totally improper. No one else has surely been asked to do this. So again, we put in a Freedom of Information search to find out all the other research proposals and permits that have been granted in the previous 12 months, whether such stipulations had been put on those applications, and none had. In fact, one of those permits that had been granted was granted to one of the reviewers of my proposal who'd rejected it, and he'd been allowed to take, I was only asking for fist-size specimens, but he wanted football-sized specimens, and he was allowed to have a helicopter go in and take those specimens out for him. No stipulation about photographing things before and getting approval, etc. So we knew that this was total evidence of worldview discrimination.
Yeah, it's rather remarkable, and in the providence of God, and of course living in a nation where we have these structures in place where this got exposed, you were able to actually find out. Because a lot of times, when we're doing stuff as Christians, as creationists, we sense that there's bias, we sense that there's prejudice against us, but here you actually had concrete evidence of that. Now, we got about 45 seconds in this segment. Maybe you could wrap up that thought for us.
Yeah, well, yes. We, as Christians, we need to stand up for our rights. And in fact, at the time, the president at the time had issued an executive order saying that government bureaucrats shouldn't discriminate. And so that was a perfect timing. We actually then launched a lawsuit against the Grand Canyon National Park and the Park Service, National Park Service. And that was in early May 2017.
We want to encourage folks, there was an article written in Answers in Genesis, Answers magazine. It's called The Fight for 53 Rocks. We want to encourage you to go to their website. You can actually read that story that Andrew lays out about what happened in detail and how he was discriminated against as a Christian and a geologist. Well, friends, thank you for joining us for Digging for Truth. We'll be right back after this message.
Bible and Spade is a non-technical quarterly publication published by the Associates for Biblical Research. Written from a scholarly and conservative viewpoint, Bible and Spade supports the inerrancy of the biblical record and is a must-read for both the serious Bible student and anyone asking if they can really trust the Bible. Archaeological evidence, properly interpreted, upholding the history of the Bible. Subscribe today at BibleArchaeology.org.
Digging for Truth is produced and recorded in the studios of Lighthouse TV, positively different television.
Hi, welcome back to Digging for Truth. I'm here with Dr. Andrew Snelling. Now, I want to just remind folks out there listening, we're really excited to have you with us, and we want to encourage you to check out the movie that Dr. Snelling was in a few years ago, Is Genesis History? And also that a new movie is coming out in early 2023 called The Mountains After the Flood. Is Genesis History, Mountains After the Flood. Very important films, and we encourage you to watch the first one if you haven't, and to look out for the second one in theaters near you. Now, okay, Dr. Snelling, we got the story about this discrimination that occurred. It must have been a very difficult thing to go through, but the Lord got you through that and legally got through that. And finally in August of 2017, you were able to go, if I understand it right, into the canyon to collect your rock samples, which ended up being 53 of them. So
Yes.
tell us about that, please.
Yeah, well, just should mention the superintendent of the Grand Canyon National Park eventually admitted that the proposal was well stated and should be approved. And the lawyers caved in straight away, the Justice Department and Park Service lawyers, because they could see that we had all the documentation attached to the lawsuit. So they granted the permit, they granted a research trip, and so we launched in early August 2017. I had Dr. John Whitmore, Senior Professor at Cedarville University in geology, with me. It was just as well I had a spare geologist, because we went in and we went to the first of the folds, which is the Carbon Canyon Fold, which is a spectacular bending through 90 degrees. And after collecting the samples, it was stinking hot. I had a backpack with samples on my back, and we had to go down a steep scree slope, and a rock gave way and I fell over and banged my head and knee and elbow, etc. And so, we had spare equipment with us in case something failed, and I had a spare geologist with me, which was great because he helped a lot. But what we did is we meticulously laid out where we're going to collect the samples, photographed everything. In fact, Alliance Defending Freedom, in their wisdom, sent a videographer with us, in case the Park Service accused us of doing something wrong, and he videotaped everything. And the movie you mentioned, some of that footage will be in that movie.
Excellent.
And so we collected the 53 rock samples. We had 2 small rafts. We went the full length of the canyon. We stopped at 4 folds in 3 different rock units and 53 samples. We not only collected samples from the folds, but also samples distance from the fold, because we wanted to compare, if there'd been heat and pressure in the folds, but not elsewhere, because the bending was due to heat and pressure, but elsewhere the rock was just normal, we should be able to see the difference. If there'd been no heat and pressure, the rock would be the same everywhere you sampled it. And so that was an important setup for answering this research question. So, some people think that COVID was a curse, and it was, but for me it was a blessing, because it meant all outside engagements were cancelled. I had to work from home. So I set up my geological microscope in my basement, and I spent 2,500 to 3,000 hours looking at each sample, spot by spot by spot, with a camera mounted on the microscope, photographing everything in meticulous detail. Most people don't realise, but geologists look at rocks under the microscope because we cut a very thin slice and glue it to a microscope slide, and it's ground till it's paper thin so the light can pass through it. And we've got a friend in a lab in Calgary, Alberta, who organised those microscope slides. He also did X-ray diffraction analysis, which is putting X-rays through a crushed sample, and it tells you what minerals are in the rock. And so I was able to compare his analyses against what I was seeing under the microscope to check that everything was properly identified. And then I did a meticulous review of each of the entire literature. I even got copies of theses to make sure I covered every detail, every reference, every study on these rock layers. And now I've published 3 papers already in our Online Answers Research Journal on each of the rock layers. The Tapete Sandstone, the first of the layers in which the nice 90-degree bend is in the rock, the Carbon Canyon Fold. I've also done the Bright Angel Formation and the Muar Formation, which are the first three layers of the flood rocks in the canyon. And so I'm now written the first paper on the first fold. I can refer back to my work on the Tapete Sandstone, which is exhaustive. And now I'm about to publish the paper on the first of these folds. And that paper also includes scanning electron microscope photographs, because we wanted to look at the grains in 3. See, rock thin sections under a geological microscope you can only see in 2 dimensions. But a scanning electron microscope you can see in the grains and the cement in 3 dimensions. And so that was very important, because I had to dot every I and cross every T in this research, knowing that it will be scrutinised by our opponents. And so everything has to be done in meticulous detail.
Oh, that's excellent. I think the one major point that we come away with, I'll give you a minute to wrap this up, and then we'll talk more in part 2, is you're looking in there a lot. You said a lot, so I don't want to gloss over that. But the one point I got out of this that people should emphasize, you're looking for evidence that this stuff was bent by some kind of heat. Metamorphosis of some sort should take place.
Yeah, or if the grains had been crushed, the cement had been broken, those sorts of things we're looking for.
Okay, and
because if the rock had been bent before it was cemented, soon after it was deposited in the flood, the cement would be pristine, unbroken, and the grains would still show the features that they had when they were deposited.
That's excellent, excellent. All right, Dr. Snelling, thanks for all of that. Excellent first episode, and we'll be back with you for part 2. Friends, thank you for watching Digging for Truth. I think you get the sense here that first, that Christian scientists do real research, rigorous, meticulous research. And the claim that we don't is a false claim. And the second is that religious discrimination does take place. In this case, it was uncovered. Thank the Lord that that was the case. And Dr. Snelling was able to complete his research. And so please pray for him as he continues to conduct this work on the Grand Canyon. And join us for our next episode with him for Digging for Truth.